up to the book of Hebrews. We're still there. Might be a little jumpy today. I need your prayer because I kind of was working on things through the week and got to Thursday late afternoon and God said, yeah, you're not going to do that yet. So I had to change tack a little bit, and I just hope it all kind of has come together. But in looking at the book of Hebrews, we've been looking at it from a very specific way, in the sense of that it was written before 70 AD, before the destruction of the temple, and the Jewish believers, the Messianic believers of the day were really struggling in their walk of how do we live this life, trying to understand what it means, but also that sense of being cut off from the temple. Because they believed in Yeshua, they were being cut off and not allowed and denied access and all the other things that could be happening to them. And so they were cut off from what is really the presence of God, what's supposed to be the presence of God on earth, dwelling in the temple, in the Holy of Holies. And it was 3 times a year, their life revolved around coming to that place, coming to Jerusalem, coming to the temple. Every male in Israel was to appear before Adonai in order to present their offerings, to stand in his presence. It's a command to appear before him. And it's also that invitation from him. He wants us. He wants his people to come and stand and be before him. He wants his people to draw near. And so their whole life revolved around that and planning for that and directing that these 3 times a year, being there in Jerusalem. But how can these Jewish believers in Yeshua draw near if they've been kicked out, if they've been denied access to the temple, they've been prevented from participating or making an offering on days like that? They were essentially being treated, at best, equal to one of the Gentiles. The Gentiles were not allowed to go past a certain point, a soreg. They were not allowed to go past that point. There was this dividing wall that prevents the Gentiles from going any closer. And these Jewish people, these citizens of Israel, were not allowed, because of their faith in Yeshua, they were not allowed to go past that. That's if they were treated at least as well as a Gentile. But there's a possibility that they were treated worse than the Gentile because of the conflict, because of their faith in Yeshua, because they were being pushed out and kicked out and not allowed, that they might not have even been allowed into the temple courts at all, the courts of the Gentiles even. So here they are, the citizen of the nation, descendant of Abraham, denied what had been their life up to that point, treated like or lower than a Gentile who wants to approach the Lord. What can they do? How can they live? How can this go on if the high priest accuses them and refuses to count them among the people? How can they draw near if the mechanism that's been outlined within the Torah is denied to them? That would be a hard question. In the last year or two, a lot of people in this country have been feeling what it's like to have your lives cut off, right? Where you're not allowed to go into work, you're not allowed to go into school, for whatever reason. The reasons now may be different, but doesn't it throw your entire life off when all of a sudden you can't do what your normal routine is? And you're starting to wonder, how can I function? How can I continue? When is this going to get back to normal? That's the kind of feelings that they would be having when they were cut out from the temple. And what's amazing when you consider this is written in maybe the early to mid 60s AD, before the fall of the temple. They were being kicked out, and what's amazing and what's so sad about that whole situation is that just a few years later, from writing and reading this letter, it wasn't just the Messianic believers who had to deal with life without the temple anymore. It was all of them. All of them had to deal with life without the temple. All the Jewish people would have to ask and try to answer that same question, because the temple in which they drew near was destroyed. And those who kicked out the Messianic believers in Yeshua, who denied them access, were themselves denied access. They were kicked out of the Temple Mount. It was destroyed. They had no place to go, no place to serve, no place to minister, no place to draw near to the Lord. And their own writings describe the cause of it being this baseless hatred is one of the major causes of why the temple fell. And they don't quite identify what the baseless hatred was directed toward. But you get a sense. A baseless hatred is one that has no merit. A baseless hatred is one that is not valid or justified. And that sounds a lot like what is really happening to the believers in Messiah Yeshua. So here they were, suddenly, both of them were in the same boat, asking the same questions. How can we draw near to God without the temple? And so the Jewish people have been asking that same kind of question ever since. How do we live this life? How can we draw near to God without the altar, without the temple, without the sacrifices, without the priesthood, without the high priest? It's actually one of the areas and one of the ways in which the Messianic believer actually had an advantage over everybody else, over the other Jewish people who had rejected Yeshua, because they still had a way. And so do we. Even if most of those who claim faith in Yeshua don't take advantage of it the way we should, or haven't known or known how or what was significance of it for centuries, we have a way of drawing near. When you're looking at these passages in Hebrews, when it's laying out this argument of why Yeshua is so necessary and so valid and so much better and greater for your walk of faith, and not to go back to life in the temple if they require that you reject Yeshua. That was the requirement. Hey guys, we'll be happy to let you back in. You just got to deny that you believe in Yeshua is the Messiah. A way to draw near. You know, as I understand it, even after the destruction of the temple, for a while, you know, the priesthood, the Sanhedrin, they were trying to maintain some semblance of function, some semblance of authority. That's assuming that they survived, you know, the slaughter and the killing of those in Jerusalem. But Jerusalem still was there as a city, even without the Temple Mount. Jerusalem was still important. It was still the center of life, and where they would always hope that a new temple would be built. But without the temple, you know, that authority, that function of the priesthood was waning, because they could no longer perform those essential duties prescribed to them. They could never bring the offerings and the sacrifices to draw near to God, because you had to come with one of those in order to draw near. And it's in the decades that after this that Rabbinic Judaism rose in its place. It solidified that special place in the life of Judaism during the Bar Kokhba revolt in the late 120s and 130s, when even Jerusalem was gone at that point. Jerusalem itself was destroyed by the Romans. But no matter what, you know, whether they were kicked out and denied access to the temple as if they were a Gentile, you know, before it was destroyed, or whether they were just like everybody else after the destruction, believers in Yeshua still had a functioning high priest. They had a high priest who was still at work, still had a place to minister, even though the temple on earth was destroyed. Hebrews chapter 8 puts it this way. Because we have this high priest who would represent them in the heavenly temple. So now here is the main point being said. So do you think this is supposed to be important? When somebody says this is the main point, you should pay attention. We do have such a Kohen Gadol. We do have such a high priest who has taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens. And he is a priestly attendant of the holies and the true tent which Adonai set up, and not man. It goes on in Hebrews chapter 9. For Messiah did not enter into holies or a sanctuary made with hands, counterparts of the true things, but into heaven itself now to appear in God's presence on our behalf. Now, is that past tense or is that present tense?
Present.
That's present. It's not a one-time and done deal. It's not a deal that happened in the past and it's now over. He appears in God's presence on our behalf. And because he is there, because he is resurrected, is he ever going to die? No. Is he ever going to need to be replaced? Is he ever going to be corrupted and have to be impeached or whatever else, No, nothing's ever going to remove him from this position. He is always living, and he's also serving in this sanctuary, in this heavenly temple. Is that temple ever going to be destroyed? Is it ever going to disappear like the one on earth does just a few years after this was written? No. So is he still there before God on our behalf? Is he still there serving in the sanctuary in heaven? Yes. All of that is a now. All of that is ongoing. And so we come to Hebrews chapter 10, verse 21. Again, it repeats that. We also have a high priest, a Kohen Gadol, over God's household. So what can we do? Even if we've been denied the earthly temple, even if we've been denied access to what we should be able to do, what can we do? Can we still draw near? Yes. Let us draw near with a true heart in full assurance of faith. That's what they thought they couldn't do anymore. They thought that we can't. How can we draw near without having access to the temple? But he says, guess what? You still can. You have a high priest that serves at a greater, higher temple, and so you can still very much so approach the throne of grace. If the readers could grasp that, if they could grasp that reality, then they would be able to stand against all of that pressure that was on them to return to the temple by denying Yeshua. They would realize that they are still a part of God's household, no matter what anybody else says. Because even to this day, many times when Jewish people come to believe and come to faith in Messiah Yeshua, what happens to them? What did their family say to them? You're no longer one of us. In fact, some will even hold a funeral of sorts for them, as if they have died. They're no longer part of the family in some circumstances. But if they would truly realize this truth, that they have a high priest who is serving at the heavenly temple, that they would realize that they are still a part of God's household, even if the high priest doesn't include them, doesn't count them, doesn't name them. And interestingly enough, we'll come to this in a little while, this word for household, guess where we see that word again in a little while? It's out of Ephesians chapter 2, where he's talking about the Gentiles being members of God's household. We'll come to that in just a little while. But they need to understand that they still have a true heart, even though they're being denied and kicked out. They still should have a full assurance of faith. How much of an assurance should they have? A little bit? See, everything that they were experiencing in life was telling them that you can't have an assurance at all. If you do, you have a whole lot of doubt that goes along with it. And he is telling them, no, you don't need to worry about that. You don't need to worry about those opinions. You still have a true heart. You still have this full assurance of faith. You can still draw near to God. And that word draw near, I'm not going to try to pronounce that again. But it means to approach. Why do you find that funny? Would somebody else like to pronounce this? No?
Prosser-chomai?
Yeah, not quite. Proser-chomai.
I think you're doing it.
Proser-chomai. See, you made me do it. And it was probably not right. So, to approach.
Certainly did.
It means to approach. To come near or to go unto. That song we were singing, "Come, let us go up to the mountain." It's that same kind of word. In the Septuagint, you'll see it in places like in Esther chapter 5, where she is going before, approaching the king. Right? And was that safe for her to do that?
Not at all.
No, it was not safe. He had to grant her the ability to appear before his presence without invitation. You also see in the Septuagint, again, that's the Greek translation of the Old Testament. You see it in Exodus chapter 12, interestingly enough, in the context of Passover. But if an outsider dwells with you who would keep the Passover for Adonai, all his males must be circumcised. Then let him draw near and keep it. And he will be like one who is native to the land, but no uncircumcised person may eat from it. So the same Torah applies to the native as well as the outsider who dwells or who approaches or who draws near among you. That's the word ger in Hebrew. The one who is drawing near. And interestingly enough, the outsider who draws near, the word that is used and translated there is the word proselyte. Y'all familiar with that term? It's actually very related to this one. One who draws near, a proselyte, is one who approaches. So they're from the same family of words together. And so here we are in this situation where the temple is not there in Jerusalem, even to this day, 2,000 plus years later. How can we, both Jew and Gentile, draw near all of this time? And so much of what the book of Hebrews does is it points us back to Abraham. How does Abraham know all the things that he knows? How does Abraham know well before the tabernacle was ever described to Moses, well before the priesthood was established, that his temporary status in the land was going to one day change into a city whose foundations and architect is God? So this is how Hebrews chapter 11, that chapter of faith, describes him. How did any of them or any of us qualify for a statement like this? Where it says, these all died in faith, without receiving, without seeing, without gaining all those things that promised. But they saw them and welcomed them from afar, from a distance. And they confessed that they were strangers and sojourners on the earth. They saw something about the future, about where God was going, where God was taking them, that they could not see in their immediate reality. And that future that they could not see was so real to them that it affected how they lived in the world today. And because they believed that future, they lived as strangers and sojourners in their now. Are we any different? Or should we be any different? No, we shouldn't be any different. People of faith should believe so much in the promise and where God is going, where God is taking everybody, that it changes who we are and how we live now. Does that make sense? But how could he see those things? How could they see those things? How could Abraham look forward, as he talks about in John chapter 8, how could he look forward to seeing Yeshua's day? Your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day, Yeshua says. He saw it and was thrilled or was glad. Of course, how was that statement received in the conversation they were having? Not very well. In fact, they didn't understand how it was possible that they thought he was older or been around longer than Abraham, and they were kind of right about that. But your father Abraham rejoiced to seeing it. How could he see it? What was he doing, or what was he gaining in his experience with the Lord that he was able to see even what was coming in the far future? Because again, he didn't even have the temple at this point. He didn't have the tabernacle. He didn't have the priesthood. He didn't have the high priest. He didn't have the sacrifices that were prescribed there, the offerings. Abraham, but he did have a high priest already. He had this high priest, as Hebrews talks about, in the order of Melchizedek. That's the end of chapter 6. Yeshua has entered there as a forerunner on our behalf, having become the high priest, the Kohen Gadol forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. And he is serving at this heavenly tabernacle from which the earthly tabernacle and temple was patterned. And so Abraham was able to seek the Father, to draw near to the Father, to draw near to God, to see all of those things from afar, because Yeshua has been serving in that role and in that place all along. And one of the primary roles that such a priest would have is overseeing the announcement of the important times on the biblical calendar. Those appointed times, those moed, when God invites his people to draw near. God has had his people watching for them, looking for them, supposed to know when those appointed times. They've been supposed to know about those things since Genesis. All right, this is Genesis chapter 1, verse 14. It says, "Then God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to separate the day from the night. They will serve as signs," that's the Hebrew word oath. For many of your translations will say for seasons. That's a word of moedim. Seasons, we think summer, winter, fall, but it's talking really about festivals as in the appointed times, in the days and the years. So from the beginning, God was teaching his people to watch for certain things, certain signs, to designate them as those sacred times of appointment when they were supposed to go up to approach and draw near to the Lord on those special times. Leviticus 23 puts it like this. "Then Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to Bnei Israel, the children of Israel, and tell them, These are the appointed moedim of Adonai, which you are proclaimed to be holy convocations." And that's the word mikra, a sacred assembly. He calls them my appointed times, my moedim. Well, I don't think that's supposed to be. So from the beginning, he was doing all of that. And where do they assemble? Where are they supposed to do this sacred assembly?
Jerusalem.
Well, eventually it's going to be there in Jerusalem, but they're not in Jerusalem yet. They're at the tabernacle, right? What that is, the important thing about the tabernacle, though, is that's supposed to be his presence. So it's before him that they are supposed to assemble. After the Exodus, that occurred at the tabernacle. But what did they do before the tabernacle? Abraham, the father of the people of God, would have known what those signs were and what they meant, and then known when they were supposed to happen. He knew what to look for all along. He would have appeared before Adonai on those days because Abraham listened to his voice. He kept my charge, my commandments, my mitzvot, my decrees, and my instructions. Because y'all remember what that last word is, right? Kept my Torah, my instructions. And because Abraham obeyed and would have known the signs, known the appointed days of assembly, he was able to see, because he was listening, because he was obeying, because he was keeping those feasts, he was able to see that far into the future, into what God was planning, where the Father was taking the world and the future king that was preparing everything for them. See, God wanted Abraham, he wants his people to see that future so we can believe it, so we can actually anticipate it, long for it, live his current life, live our current lives in light of that future promise. And it's so he could pass on that knowledge and that assurance of promise to his children so they would be ready when all these things actually start coming to pass. So they would be aware of it. So they would know what to do or what to look for, what it means. That's what the Moedim are supposed to do for the people of God. That's what the appointed times, the feast days, are supposed to do for the people of God. That's why they are sacred assemblies, where we can draw near to the King and he can share with us what he is going to do or what he is doing, so we can practice our part, so we can see it. When you look at that word mikra, it's a convocation, a reading or a calling together, a sacred assembly. And it comes from a word closely, kara, which means to summon or invite, to call for, call and commission. So he calls these things, these sacred assemblies, but they are by invitation. He is inviting his people. How many times does Yeshua talk about in the New Testament about the master who is preparing a banquet? And what does he do? He says, go out and find those that have been invited. It's one of these.
But they kept making excuses.
They kept making excuses. What kind of excuses do we still make for not accepting the invitation? We've been making a lot of them. This is also understood as a rehearsal. A dress rehearsal or a practice. What do? There's a performance off in the future, right? But in order to get ready for it, you've got to know your lines, you've got to know your role, when you come in, where you step, where you go. A rehearsal for those things. And so that's what the feasts are supposed to be. They're by invitation. And they're so that we can be aware of what he is doing. And so as the people of God gathered to keep these Moedim, they are practicing, they're getting this glimpse of what God was and is going to do. And so I believe the feasts were really the primary way that Abraham was able to look and see so far ahead, to see the Messiah in Yeshua's day in John chapter 8. He was able to look and see into the future of God's plan and God's purpose. How he was able to see Messiah's day and be glad because the Father invited him. Invited Israel to meet him at these appointed times. And so that invitation from God to the people of God, has that been rescinded? Is that invitation gone and it's like, don't worry about it, you don't have to worry about it? Or does that promise, or does that invitation still stand? Yeah. Are the stars still up there directing the seasons, directing the times and the signs for the Moedim? Yeah, they're still doing it. Whether we know it or understand it or process it or not, it's still doing it. The invitation is still open, but yet how many times do we give excuses? See, it still stands because Yeshua is still there. Yeshua is still the high priest. He is still serving in the heavenly tabernacle. He is the one that's overseeing the moon and the stars and designating and announcing those feasts. He is still inviting God's people to come up to him and meet with him. And he does it every year with the appointed times, the feasts. Some of y'all have seen this picture before. See, in keeping the feasts of the Lord, we're accepting that invitation to draw near. We are demonstrating our desire to be near to him. We are demonstrating our desire to listen to his commands, to show up when he sets the appointment. You know, I put it like this before, some of y'all know this. If you feel sick and you call your doctor and you want to make an appointment with your doctor, do you get to dictate to the doctor when you're going to show up? If you can pull that off, I kind of want to meet you and shake your hand. Because that doesn't typically happen. You call the doctor and they tell you when to show up. That's what's happening here. The Lord has told us when he wants us to show up. And so we are demonstrating that we want to keep the appointment. In keeping the feast, we are practicing our part. And so we are also getting a glimpse of those things that he wants to tell us. Things that have come or remain coming to pass. The feasts tell the whole redemption story. From beginning to end. What we typically call, and grew up calling, the gospel. You know, the plan and the purpose of God, of what God will do to secure the salvation and the transformation of his people, how he saves us from our sin, how he transforms us and gives us a new heart that is receptive to the new covenant, like we talked about last week. But the gospel includes how he comes in power and glory to establish his kingdom. That's also the gospel. Where the things and the patterns of this world are overturned and set right and restore the closeness that existed between God and humanity before the garden was lost by our sin. See, every year we are invited to participate and learn more about the gospel. And by keeping and participating in the spring feasts, we go through a dress rehearsal for our redemption. Right, I'm zooming in a little bit here. About March or April, there is the Passover. What happens at Passover to the Messiah? He dies. Right, that's the crucifixion. The Passover lamb, behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. It's during the week of unleavened bread, the sinless offerings. And then something happens here on first fruits. What happens on that day?
Resurrection.
It's the resurrection. Right? The significance of the resurrection was because it was fulfilling the feast of first fruits. And then something happened 50 days later. We typically call it Pentecost. But that's the giving of the Holy Spirit. It also parallels the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai. Right? All of these feasts, these spring feasts from March and April over into May, all of them were fulfilled to the day in Yeshua's first coming as Messiah ben Yosef, son of Joseph, the suffering and even the unrecognized servant. But now we are actually starting to enter into the fall feasts, starting Monday night with the Feast of Trumpets, Yom Teruah. On the first day of this month, it's either September, late September, things like that. We are entering into this season. And these feasts, they give greater insight into the second coming of Yeshua. That one where the gospel is completed, where he establishes his kingdom as Messiah, the son of David, the conquering king. And one day he will arrive to fulfill these. Just like he fulfilled the spring feast. So keeping the feasts really is essential, is an essential part of our faith in Messiah. It's an essential part in our understanding the gospel, and we never should have left them behind, because they are intended to keep us from being in the dark. They are intended to help us be aware of what is happening and what God is doing and where God is going. And it's most tragic when we miss it. It is most tragic when we don't recognize those moments of what God is doing. In fact, that is a major contributing factor to the destruction of the temple. The fact that those were not recognized. See, even when we're getting let in on what God is doing, even if we're keeping and practicing the feasts, the spring feast, the fall feast, we don't always understand the big picture. We can still get a little confused. We can still get a little lost in some of the exact details of how and when. Because even though the Jewish people had been keeping the feasts for centuries, even those who were keeping the feasts got their fulfillment out of order. They wanted to start down here. They wanted to start with Rosh Hashanah, the head of the year, the Feast of Trumpets, because that is the day of the victorious establishment of the kingdom, where Messiah, son of David, is sitting on the throne. And in thinking that they all had it out, that maybe some of us do the same thing with all the charts and things that we've got out there. Y'all seen those before, of prophecy, fulfillment, and all the things where they're just mapped out in a perfect succession as if we have everything lined up perfectly? Good luck with that. They thought they had it all figured out, and so then they missed the redemption and deliverance like they were coming out of Egypt. They didn't understand that has to happen first. Coming out of Egypt has to happen first before they're ready for this. Before they can go to the mountain and establish the kingdom as the people of God. They have to be redeemed. Sin has to be dealt with first. Of course, none of us, we would never make that mistake, would we? We'd never put our interpretations and our understandings or our expectations, our wants and desires. We'd never be so convinced that we think we've got it all figured out, right? But look, what happens is in the tragic misunderstanding, even when the people who were drawing near for Passover, how we can miss it. And what was supposed to be giving them a greater vision, what was supposed to be giving them a greater understanding of God's purpose and plan, it was still hidden from their eyes. And there were consequences when the master arrived to find the servants not prepared for his arrival. When they didn't understand the message and the meaning of the feast like Abraham did. In Luke chapter 19, Yeshua, he drew near and saw Jerusalem, and he wept over her, saying, if only you had recognized this day the things that led to shalom, to peace, to salvation. But now they are hidden from your eyes. For the days will come upon you when your enemies will surround you with barricades and hem you in on all sides, and they will smash you to the ground, you and your children within you, and they won't leave within you one stone upon another, because you did not recognize what? The time of his visitation. Because they thought they had it so figured out that, Messiah, son of David, is coming first. The kingdom is coming first. The Romans are going to be defeated first. Not some suffering servant. Not some guy who's going to end up being crucified. That's not how this works. Right? I point that out to remind us that even when we try to keep the feast, even when we try to live all of these things, none of us are immune to inserting our own wants and desires, expectations, and interpretations. We're not immune to that. We are capable of missing things just like they did. And there can be consequences. We are capable of missing things. We are capable of assuming things. We are capable of being disappointed if it doesn't happen the way we think it should, or how we think it should, or when we think it should. But again, the feasts are supposed to help us. The feasts are supposed to help us look forward to what God is doing and will do. Not to make us more afraid, not to make us fearful or nervous or just resigned to all these things, but to really fill us with hope and expectation. That's what the feasts are supposed to do. They're supposed to make us like Abraham, who died hearing and seeing the promise, but never receiving all that was promised. And as it is, they yearn for a better land. That is a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for He has prepared a city for them. What tense is that in?
Present, future.
Well, it's has prepared is kind of a past tense as if it's done, right? But
Continue.
do we have it yet? So it's also future. It's a done situation. A city has been prepared for them, but the day of fulfilling, receiving that is yet to come. See, Abraham, we are essentially in the same position that Abraham was in. God has made promises, and we should be looking forward to their fulfillment. We should believe them. We should trust them. We should live our lives in expectation of those things, because we believe that God it's done. It's settled. It's not a question of if these things are going to happen. What's our question? When? When will these things happen? The disciples asked that same kind of question. Lord, are you now going to establish your kingdom? See, Abraham could see the promised city from a distance. And I believe the feasts are what helped him see it. And all those things that have been promised, at some point, those will be fulfilled. There will be a generation that doesn't have to look far off into the future for these things. There will be a generation that sees them happen, and they're going to be best prepared for those days and for those times by keeping the feasts of the Lord. Because they're going to understand, have a better understanding of what God is doing. And we will then be called up to the mountain, called up to the New Jerusalem, and we'll go. Because notice what's also included at that time. Hebrews chapter 12. You have come to Mount Zion. They're not allowed on Mount Zion right now, the readers of Hebrews. And in a lot of ways, the Jewish people are not allowed there now. But we still have a high priest. We still have the heavenly tabernacle. We are coming to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to myriads of angels. And what kind of gathering is it? A joyous gathering. Which one of the fall feasts is centered around joy? Yeah. Tabernacles. Sukkot. That's coming in the next few weeks. That's language of the fall feasts. A joyous gathering, a wedding celebration. That's Sukkot. And he goes on and says, you're coming to this assembly with the angels and to the assembly of the firstborn who are written in a scroll in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous ones made perfect, and to Yeshua, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks of something better than the blood of Abel. So the readers of Hebrews They may think, they may be tempted, or they may be struggling. If we've been kicked out of the temple, if we're no longer counted among the people, have we lost that future? Have we lost that hope? And the answer is no. You have not lost that future and that hope at all. You have not lost it, and neither have we. That future is still certain, and we learn more about that, or as we learn more about that future, there should be growing within us a greater longing for that future that's grown in us by keeping and practicing the feasts, where we accept the invitation to draw near to Him and hear the gospel in its fullness. That's what the feasts are for. And that's starting when? Monday night into Tuesday as the Feast of Trumpets. So we are in some exciting times, and some times that should help us greater understand of where God is going and what God is doing.